It was supposed to be another easy TV hit for Kellyanne Conway. Polished, predictable, perfectly rehearsed. The cameras rolled, the lights burned hot, and that familiar smirk spread across her face as she leaned into the microphone. "I'm just saying," she began, her voice honeyed and cutting. "Some people in Congress should focus less on their wigs and more on their work." The studio chuckled. That awkward, uncertain laughter that rises when cruelty hides behind charm. She basked in it, eyes glinting like she'd delivered the line of the night. Across the table, Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her gaze stayed steady, her expression unreadable, like she'd seen this act 1,000 times before. Cameras zoomed in on her face, calm, poised, still. Behind that silence was something stronger than outrage. It was restraint. It was power contained, waiting. The moderator tried to smooth it over, fumbling for neutrality, but the tension hung heavy, alive. Viewers at home shifted in their seats. They knew what they'd just heard wasn't harmless banter. It was coded, sharp, meant to sting. The kind of jab women like Jasmine had learned to absorb without losing grace. Kellyanne pressed on, tone dripping with self-assurance. "You know, it's funny how the loudest voices in Washington are often the least effective," she said, gesturing toward Jasmine as if to punctuate her point. A few in the audience murmured. She smiled wider, mistaking discomfort for dominance. But then, for just a heartbeat, something in the room shifted. The air thickened. Even the cameras seemed to pause, anticipating what was coming. Jasmine Crockett inhaled, slow and deliberate, her composure radiating through the noise. She looked straight at Conway, not with anger, but with clarity, like someone who knows truth doesn't need volume to hit hard. Somewhere, a producer whispered, "Stay on her face," and in that frozen second, every viewer watching felt the gravity turn. This wasn't going to be another cable segment lost to the news cycle. It was about to become something else, something raw, electric, unforgettable. But when Jasmine finally opened her mouth, the entire segment and the entire narrative changed in seconds, the moment the clip hit social media. It wasn't just another argument. It was a spark in a country soaked with frustration. For months, Kellyanne Conway had been on her comeback tour, jumping from network to network with that same air of effortless confidence, rewriting history with a smile. She was the maestro of alternative facts, the one who could turn scandal into strategy and contradiction into charm. To her fans, she was sharp and unshakable. To her critics, she was the ghost of an era that refused to fade. Still spinning, still smirking, still certain she could outtalk the truth. But this time, something was different. The country had changed. People were tired. The pandemic years had bared too much. The lies had cost too much. And the public's patience for political theater had worn paper thin. Every slick dismissal, every eye roll from the powerful, now carried a different weight. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was insult. And into that fatigue walked Jasmine Crockett, a first-term congresswoman from Texas, unapologetically black, brilliant, and blunt. She had become one of the few voices on Capitol Hill that didn't speak like a politician. She spoke like someone who had spent her life fighting for people without microphones. In hearings, she didn't just question witnesses, she cornered them. She didn't posture, she prosecuted. Clips of her dismantling evasive answers had already gone viral before this night, each one proof that clarity could still cut through noise. To progressives, she was a breath of fresh air, a reminder that fire and facts could coexist. To her detractors, she was too much, too loud, too emotional. Labels that always seemed to follow women who refused to shrink. And that's exactly what made this clash so charged. On one side sat the polished architect of political gaslighting, a woman who had helped redefine truth until it bent at her will. On the other sat a congresswoman who refused to play along, who had built her entire career on calling out the spin no one else dared to touch. It wasn't just a media moment. It was a mirror to America's staring each other down. One polished and practiced, certain that performance was power. The other raw and unflinching, certain that honesty still mattered. By the time the segment began trending, every newsfeed had picked a side. Memes exploded. Tweets flew. Crockett versus Conway became shorthand for a cultural collision that had been brewing for years. The battle between presentation and purpose? Between those who weaponized words and those who wielded them for truth. Yet the viral replay only told half the story. Viewers could sense that the quiet before Jasmine's response carried something more than anger. It carried intent. She wasn't waiting to snap back. She was waiting to land something that couldn't be dismissed as sass or soundbite. Something so precise, it would break through the smug certainty across the table. As the nation replayed the smirk, the pause, the stillness, everyone felt it coming. The comment threads buzzed with anticipation. Journalists were already drafting headlines they didn't even understand yet, because deep down, people knew they were about to witness a shift. not just in a conversation but in power. What happened next didn't just trend. It rewrote the dynamic between the polished and the real, the manipulator and the truth-teller, the voice that talked over versus the one that made silence speak. Because in just 15 words, Jasmine Crockett delivered the takedown of the year, long before the studio lights and viral clips. Kellyanne Conway had already written herself into America's political bloodstream. She wasn't born into the chaos, she mastered it. Starting out as a young pollster in Washington, she learned early that numbers could be molded, that perception could be more powerful than fact. She had a gift for turning data into drama, for reading not just what people thought, but what they wanted to believe. And in a town built on illusion, that made her invaluable. By the time she joined the Trump campaign, she was a household name among insiders, a strategist with a smile sharper than her critics realized. She could twist a question into a slogan, a scandal into a soundbite. She didn't just survive controversy, she danced with it, treating outrage like oxygen. When she coined the phrase alternative facts, it wasn't a slip, it was a blueprint. The country gasped, commentators fumed, but Kellyanne, she smiled, knowing she'd just redefined the rules of engagement. In her world, truth wasn't fixed, it was flexible. Cameras adored her. She filled airtime effortlessly, spinning contradictions into coherence. Always unbothered, always composed. She sparred with journalists as if it were theater, because to her it was. Each clash was another performance, another chance to prove that control wasn't about honesty. It was about dominance. Her opponents accused her of deception, but she thrived on their outrage. Every angry headline was free publicity. Every viral clip, a reminder that in modern politics, the loudest wins. Behind that composure, though, was calculation. Kellyanne knew her audience, the weary, the disillusioned, the ones who saw her confidence as competence. She spoke their language, us versus them, strength over empathy. She learned to weaponize mockery, to make ridicule sound like reason. When confronted, she'd pivot, smile, and drop a line so ambiguous it could mean anything to anyone. It was art, in a way, the art of never being pinned down. But that art came with arrogance. Over the years, she'd grown accustomed to being untouchable. Interviews blurred into monologues, panels became her playground. She dismissed challengers with charm and thinly veiled contempt, particularly women who didn't fit her version of success. Once, she laughed off a young journalist's question about accountability with, "Oh honey, that's not how this works." The audience laughed with her then too. For years they always did. She built an empire of spin and learned to mistake noise for power. Even after leaving the White House, she carried that aura with her, equal parts survivor and provocateur. Every appearance was a reminder that she could still command attention. But attention is a fickle throne. Somewhere between the late-night interviews and the endless self-assured quips, the culture had shifted beneath her. The old playbook, the winks, the dismissals, the mockery, no longer worked the way it used to. People weren't laughing anymore. They were listening, and they were tired. That night in the studio, she didn't see it yet. She saw the cameras, the lights, the familiar rhythm of confrontation she'd mastered years ago. She saw another opponent to outtalk, another moment to remind the world she could still dominate a conversation. Jasmine Crockett wasn't a politician in Kellyanne's mind, just another target, another headline waiting to be shaped. When Conway launched her jab, she expected the usual outcome: discomfort, maybe a stammered defense, and then a clip that would circulate with her grinning in control. But what she missed was the silence, the pause, the way Jasmine's stillness unsettled the rhythm. In that quiet, something shifted that Kellyanne's instincts couldn't register. The formula that had always worked began to crumble. Because this opponent wasn't reacting, she was observing. There was irony in that moment, thick enough to taste. Kellyanne, who had spent decades crafting narratives, was now standing inside one she couldn't edit. She was the villain of a story she didn't even realize she'd entered. And the very thing she'd built her legacy on, words, was about to betray her. For years, her smirk had been the final word. It had ended debates, deflected truths, and cemented her power. But this time, her own weapon words would turn against her, because across from her sat someone who had learned to survive. Far sharper attacks than words. Long before the cameras, long before the viral moments and the trending hashtags, Jasmine Crockett was standing in courtrooms where no one was filming. The air was heavy with the smell of old carpet and tension, the kind that builds when truth has to fight for a seat at the table. She was a young attorney then, representing clients who couldn't afford to lose but didn't have the power to win. The judges knew her name before long, not because she was loud, but because she was relentless. Every case was a war for dignity. She fought them with the same fire that had been burning since her childhood in St. Louis. She had seen what injustice looked like up close. It wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, A form denied, a door closed, a smirk from someone who thought the rules only applied to others. That was the world she grew up challenging, long before she ever imagined walking the halls of Congress. She learned early that the system didn't respect politeness, it respected persistence. So she made that her weapon. When protests filled the streets and voices cried for reform, Jasmine didn't just march. She represented those arrested for demanding change. Her days blurred into nights, files stacking higher than sleep. She carried her clients' stories like armor, mothers, students, workers, all ordinary people crushed by extraordinary neglect. And each victory, no matter how small, taught her something that would define her career. The truth will never defend itself. Someone has to stand for it. Politics wasn't in her plan. It was a calling that found her. Texas needed someone who wouldn't fold, someone who would ask questions others avoided. When she ran for the state legislature, she didn't come with donor money or polished consultants. She came with credibility, the kind earned in sweat, not speeches. She walked into rooms where she wasn't expected, stood behind microphones where she wasn't welcomed, and spoke anyway. Each time she told the truth, someone somewhere said, "You're too bold." But boldness was the point. In Austin, she became known for her cross-examinations that made power flinch. When others filibustered, she focused. When they postured, she pressed for facts. The establishment didn't quite know what to do with her. They called her a firebrand, code for unbought. But for Jasmine, every clash carried the weight of more than policy. It carried the memory of those she'd defended, those still unseen. Politics was not performance, it was personal. By the time she entered Congress, she'd already weathered more storms than most. She knew how to take hits and keep moving. She understood that as a black woman in power, her margin for error was thinner, her every word dissected. Yet she never softened herself to fit the room. She wore her truth like armor. Her calm was her counterpunch. When pundits accused her of being too emotional, she smiled and reminded them, "Emotion built the country they loved," to quote. When critics questioned her tone, she pointed to results. Her speeches weren't written for applause, they were written for impact. Every sentence carried a pulse, a rhythm of defiance wrapped in grace. To her supporters, she was the voice they'd been waiting to hear. A woman who didn't flinch when facing the polished condescension of those who thought experience meant authority. And then came the moment that would test her composure on the biggest stage yet. A live panel, millions watching, and across from her, Kellyanne Conway, the embodiment of everything Jasmine had spent her career dismantling. The producer's voice echoed in her earpiece, the countdown rolling. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing on her shoulders, the way it always did when representation wasn't just about one person, but about everyone who'd been told they didn't belong. For Jasmine, that tension wasn't fear, it was fuel. Every insult she'd ever heard, every door that had ever been closed, every patronizing grin, it all lived in that stillness before the broadcast began. She didn't need to raise her voice to match Conway's bravado. She'd learned long ago that the most devastating truth is often spoken softly. When Kellyanne took her first shot, Jasmine recognized it instantly for what it was, an old tactic in a new setting. Dismissal disguised as humor, power masquerading as charm. She'd seen that face across negotiating tables, in courtrooms, in the sneer of authority figures who never expected her to answer back. But now, the stage was different, and so was the audience. She wasn't there just as a congresswoman. She was there as proof that intellect and integrity could stand tall against arrogance and artifice. Every woman watching who had ever been talked over, every young activist who'd been told to wait their turn, they were in that room with her, unseen but present, and Jasmine knew the power of that presence. The country had watched countless exchanges like this before, men or women polished and privileged, dismissing those who didn't fit their mold. But this time, the script was about to break. Jasmine had no interest in trading insults. She dealt in truth, and she knew truth didn't need permission to sting. For her, this wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning, a moment to hold a mirror to the old guard and remind them that the world they built no longer belonged solely to them. So when Kellyanne tried to belittle her on national television, Jasmine Crockett didn't see an insult. She saw an opportunity. Kellyanne started strong, or at least she thought she did. Her voice carried that familiar rhythm, the sing-song cadence of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of domination through conversation. She interrupted before the moderator could finish, her hands slicing through the air like punctuation. "You see, this is what's wrong with Congress today," she said, eyes darting toward Jasmine. "Too many people playing dress-up as leaders and not enough doing the work." A smirk followed, deliberate, practiced. The audience murmured. Jasmine didn't react. She sat perfectly still, hands folded, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't mockery, it was patience. She knew the rhythm, knew the trap. Let her talk. Let her show the country who she really was. Kellyanne mistook that quiet for weakness. "Oh, come on," she continued, rolling her eyes toward the moderator. You can't take someone seriously who spends more time on social media than legislating. Laughter from a few corners of the studio broke the tension for a second, but it was hollow, the kind of laughter that fades too quickly. Jasmine's eyes never left her. The moderator tried to steer it back to policy, but Conway wasn't finished. She gestured animatedly, her bracelets clinking with each dismissive wave. "The problem is people like her," she said, voice rising, "who think being loud makes them right. Who think hashtags are a substitute for hard work." For the first time, Jasmine's eyebrow lifted. A subtle reaction, but enough. Those who knew her knew what that meant. The shift was coming. The energy in the studio changed almost imperceptibly. The laughter stopped. Even the air seemed heavier. Viewers at home could sense it, that pregnant silence before something breaks. Jasmine's hand tightened just slightly on the desk, the tendons in her wrist visible beneath the bright studio lights. Slow, deliberate. A silent signal that she was ready to enter the ring. Kellyanne kept talking, her words speeding up now as if volume could drown out the discomfort settling over the room. "You know, Jasmine," she said, using her first name like a weapon. "It's cute when you talk about integrity, but maybe try living it." The moderator inhaled sharply. A few people in the audience looked down at their notes. Even the cameraman hesitated, unsure whether to stay on Kellyanne or pan to Jasmine. And still, Jasmine smiled. That same calm, unbothered composure that had carried her through protests, hearings, and interrogations, much harsher than this. She didn't need to fight for the microphone. She knew silence was louder when earned. Then came the pause. That split second when even Kellyanne felt the energy drop out from under her. Words still came, but they didn't land. They hung there, brittle and weightless. She looked across the table, expecting a rebuttal, maybe outrage. Instead, Jasmine met her eyes, steady, piercing, with a hint of something that unnerved even the most practiced of performers: empathy. It wasn't pity. It was understanding, the kind that says, "I've seen people like you before, and I know how this ends." The studio audience shifted again. A few whispered to each other. One man near the front leaned forward, as if watching a car on the edge of a skid. The moderator looked from one woman to the other, sensing the inevitable. Kellyanne leaned back, satisfied she'd won the moment. "See," she said, smiling. "Nothing to say." And that was it, the mistake, the overreach, the line that flipped the balance. Because Jasmine did have something to say. She'd been waiting not to win an argument, but to let the truth breathe before she spoke it. The air around her seemed to tighten, the hum of cameras barely audible. The faint creak of her chair broke the silence as she leaned forward. Kellyanne's smirk faltered for the first time, and then Jasmine leaned forward, and everything went silent. For a heartbeat, the studio hung in suspension, the kind of silence that vibrates more than it rests. Kellyanne sat back, arms folded, the hint of triumph still curling at the edges of her smile. But across from her, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just listening. She was studying, calculating, the calm before precision. Then she spoke softly at first. "You know, Ms. Conway," Jasmine began, her voice even deliberate, every word measured like the first drop of rain before a storm. "People like you have spent years perfecting how to talk over people like me." The smirk twitched. Kellyanne tilted her head, half grin returning, trying to play amused. But Jasmine continued. "You've built a whole career out of making noise sound like wisdom, out of dressing disrespect up as insight, out of turning pain into punchlines. But here's the thing." She leaned in, and the microphone seemed to catch even her breathing. "You can't gaslight someone who's lived in the dark and learned to build her own light." The audience didn't move. The moderator's mouth opened slightly, not enough to interrupt, just enough to forget how to speak. Jasmine continued, her tone still calm, still controlled. But now, it carried the unmistakable rhythm of truth that cuts deeper than anger ever could. "See, you keep confusing arrogance with strength. You think talking louder means you're winning. But the women I come from, the ones who had to shout without microphones just to be heard, they taught me something you'll never understand. Silence can be power too." Kellyanne blinked. Once, twice. That smirk, gone. "And when you sit there," Jasmine said, her hand gesturing lightly toward Conway, "and call me cute, or say I'm just performing for cameras, what you're really doing is confessing that you don't recognize a woman who doesn't need your permission to speak." That line landed like thunder. Somewhere in the back of the studio, a producer exhaled audibly, as if remembering to breathe. A few audience members exchanged glances. That electric recognition when everyone realizes they're witnessing a moment that will live online forever. Jasmine wasn't done. You've spent years trying to redefine truth, to make lies fashionable. But the truth doesn't bend because you say it prettier. The truth doesn't disappear because you talk faster. The truth, she paused, her gaze locked on Conway, waits. It always waits. And tonight, it's sitting right here. The camera caught Kellyanne blinking again, her eyes darting toward the moderator for rescue that wasn't coming. Jasmine leaned back slightly now, her tone shifting from personal to universal. For every little girl watching this, everyone who's ever been told she was too loud, too black, too emotional, too much, understand this when they mock you. It's because they're scared of the sound of your voice, because your voice makes their comfort tremble. The studio audience was stone still. Even the lights felt brighter, sharper, as if reflecting off the moment itself. Kellyanne tried to interject, "Oh, come on, that's..." But Jasmine raised a single hand. Calm, firm, commanding. "No, you had your time. You used it to insult. I'm using mine to remind you, and everyone watching, that dignity isn't something you can shout over." It wasn't a yell. It wasn't a rant. It was a verdict. Somewhere, a phone notification buzzed, then another. Viewers online were already clipping the moment, adding captions. "You can't gaslight someone who's lived in the dark. Silence can be power too." She ate no crumbs. Jasmine's words continued, not as a monologue, but as a mirror. "You called me a performer, Kellyanne. But the real act has always been pretending cruelty is strategy, pretending indifference is intellect, pretending that disrespect is debate. You mistake composure for weakness because you've never met a woman who can slice through falsehood with a whisper." The moderator glanced nervously at the clock, but the energy in the room had shifted beyond control. This wasn't television anymore. It was transformation. Jasmine ended with a slow exhale, eyes steady on Conway. "So here's my advice. Next time you come for someone, make sure you're ready for the truth to answer back." And with that, silence again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was electric. The kind that makes skin prickle, that makes seconds feel sacred. Kellyanne sat frozen. No words, no counter. Just the faint trace of realization flickering behind her eyes, the moment she understood she wasn't in control of the narrative anymore. The moderator tried to regain composure, voice trembling slightly. "Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for..." But it didn't matter. The moment had already escaped the studio. It was racing across timeline's headlines, and hashtags faster than anyone could contain it. A producer in the control room muttered, "That's the clip." Another whispered, "It's already viral." Within minutes, Twitter was ablaze. One tweet read, "Kellyanne tried to play chess. Jasmine brought the whole board." Another, "She just changed the tone of every panel for the next decade." On TikTok, remixes were already being cut. Slow-motion replays of Jasmine's calm face. Text overlays quoting her lines. On Instagram, fan pages were cropping her still frame, adding captions like, "Grace is the loudest clapback." Meanwhile, in the studio, the air slowly came back to life. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. And for the first time that night, Kellyanne looked small. Not defeated, but dwarfed by truth, by composure, by the weight of a moment she couldn't spin away. Jasmine simply sat back, the faintest smile returning. Not the smile of victory, but of release. She didn't gloat, didn't lean in, didn't feed the spectacle. She just let the silence speak for her, because that was the lesson. Dignity doesn't need an encore. And as the credits prepared to roll, as the world began to type, share, and replay her every word, one truth became undeniable. The performance that was supposed to belong to Kellyanne had just been reclaimed, rewritten, and reborn in Jasmine Crockett's voice. But the real explosion wasn't in that studio. It was online. The world didn't just watch that exchange, it detonated. Within minutes, the hashtag Crockett moment was trending in 5 countries. Twitter became a fireworks display of disbelief and delight. One tweet read, "Kellyanne Conway just got Crocketted. We need that in the dictionary." Others said, "That's not a debate. That's a masterclass in controlled demolition." Clips of the moment flooded every platform. On TikTok, creators looped Jasmine's calm voice over trap beats. Her line, "You can't gaslight someone who's lived in the dark and learned to build her own light," echoing like poetry. On Instagram Reels, influencers lip-synced her words, adding captions like, "When your ex tries to rewrite history." It wasn't just political commentary anymore. It was cultural currency. CNN ran the clip hourly. MSNBC called it a defining political mic drop. Fox tried to spin it as performative outrage. But even their segment was interrupted by an audience member's laugh that the mic still picked up. By nightfall, even late-night hosts joined in. One joked, "Kellyanne Conway met her match, and her match lit a fire on live TV." Editorials poured in the next morning. The Atlantic called it a generational reckoning in real time. The Root declared Jasmine Crockett didn't just clap back, she reclaimed the conversation. And Vanity Fair simply headlined, "The night dignity went viral." Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett sat in her apartment, glow of her phone lighting her face as message after message poured in. Thousands, from strangers, from supporters, from women she'd never met, but who somehow felt seen. One DM read, "You spoke for every woman who's ever been told to be smaller." Another, "My daughter saw that clip and said, she looks like me," for Jasmine. It was overwhelming, not in volume, but in meaning. She'd gone toe-to-toe with one of the most practiced media manipulators in modern politics and had stayed true to herself. No shouting, no theatrics, just truth. And that truth was echoing in living rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms across America. Cable networks analyzed every frame. Body language experts broke down the moment Jasmine leaned in. One commentator said, "It wasn't aggression, it was command." Others compared it to iconic moments in debate history. Obama's "Please proceed," Governor, or Kamala Harris's "I'm speaking." But this was different. This was rawer, quieter, more deliberate, a victory born not from spectacle, but from restraint. Conway's silence afterward became its own story. For once, the woman who could always find a soundbite had none. She disappeared from interviews for a few days, issuing only a single tweet. Sometimes, silence says more, but even that backfired. Replies flooded in. Exactly. Jasmine's silence said everything. By the weekend, artists were painting murals of Jasmine's face in vibrant tones of red, gold, and blue. Someone projected her quote on a downtown building in Dallas. Teachers shared it in classrooms as an example of composure under pressure. Civil rights activists quoted her words in speeches about integrity and truth. It wasn't just politics, it was vindication. For every young black woman watching, it was proof that calm could still conquer chaos, that dignity could still defeat derision. Jasmine hadn't just responded to Kellyanne Conway. She'd responded to a generation's exhaustion with performative cruelty. She'd shown that poise could be power, and in that, she became more than a trending topic. She became a symbol. The White House press secretary was asked about it in the next briefing. She smiled and said, "I think Congresswoman Crockett reminded everyone that respect still matters." Even opponents, begrudgingly, admitted it was one of the cleanest takedowns ever seen on live television. But amid all the noise, all the memes, all the talk shows and hot takes, there was one image that stood out most. A photo snapped by a producer just after the cameras cut. Jasmine sitting at the panel table, shoulders relaxed, eyes soft, phone buzzing in her hand. In that single frame, she looked both exhausted and victorious. A woman who had carried a storm and still kept her balance. Somewhere, another tweet was going viral. "The spin lost to sincerity tonight. It summed up everything." The empire of manipulation, the decades of polished deceit, had finally met something it couldn't outtalk: authenticity. And it felt like the country exhaled with her. But even in that tidal wave of celebration, Jasmine knew something deeper lingered. The conversation wasn't over. Not for her, not for the people who saw themselves in her steadiness. The moment was already history. But what came next would define the legacy. Because when the applause faded and the lights dimmed, she turned to the moderator, who was still stunned into silence, and said quietly, almost to herself, something that made everyone in earshot pause. And yet, what Jasmine said next, after the cameras stopped rolling, hit even harder. When the noise finally died down and the lights of the studio dimmed, Jasmine sat alone for a moment, still in her chair, still composed. The air was heavy with the afterglow of what had just unfolded. The staff whispered. The crew packed up equipment, and outside the world was already dissecting every second. But Jasmine wasn't thinking about the headlines. She was thinking about the why. In her mind, it wasn't about winning a debate or outsmarting an opponent. It was about holding space for truth in a culture that too often rewards whoever can talk the loudest. She knew what people would say, that it was a clapback, that she had dragged Kellyanne Conway. And sure, it was satisfying to see arrogance humbled. But to Jasmine, the deeper victory was quieter. She thought of her grandmother's words. "You don't have to shout to be heard by the right people." That's what she had carried into the studio. That's what had steadied her when the condescension came. Because she wasn't there to perform, she was there to represent. Every woman who'd been interrupted, every worker who'd been dismissed, every young person who'd been told to wait their turn, she understood that politics, at its core, isn't about power, it's about purpose. The moment had gone viral, yes, but virality fades. What endures is what it stands for. That night, as she left the building and walked into the cool air, her phone buzzed again with notifications. Journalists, celebrities, activists, all wanting a quote, but instead of replying, she paused, looked up at the city skyline, and smiled. Because she knew that what mattered most wasn't what she had said, but what people had heard. That truth still has a voice, and it doesn't have to shout. In a world where arrogance talks loudest, dignity doesn't need to raise its voice. Her confrontation with Kellyanne Conway wasn't about Democrat versus Republican, left versus right. It was about two Americas colliding, one built on the noise of spin, the other grounded in the quiet strength of conviction. One obsessed with being right, the other devoted to doing right. And for a brief, electric moment, the second America won, and that victory was a reminder that democracy doesn't survive on outrage, but on empathy. That the people who hold their ground with grace are often the ones who move the world forward. Jasmine hadn't just defended herself. She'd defended an idea that integrity is still currency, and that even in the age of chaos, composure can be revolutionary. Reporters would later call her response iconic. A cultural reset. The night dignity went viral, but for Jasmine it was simpler. It was a test of whether grace could still cut through cynicism. And when the dust settled, she knew the answer. Because what truly resonated wasn't the sound of her words. It was the silence that followed them. The silence of recognition, of reflection, of a collective sigh from a country that had forgotten what calm truth sounds like. That night, somewhere across America, young people replayed the clip. Not for entertainment, but for courage. To see someone like them hold steady when belittled, to see decency triumph over dismissal. Parents shared it with their kids. Teachers played it in classrooms, reminding them that conviction isn't about volume. It's about clarity. And that, Jasmine thought, was the real legacy. Because sometimes, the strongest statement isn't shouted. It's spoken with calm conviction. It started as another TV attack, another moment of political theater. Kellyanne Conway came armed with smirks and sound bites, ready to dominate the stage as she always had. But what she didn't expect was the silence and the woman who filled it with truth. Jasmine Crockett didn't just answer back. She reframed the conversation. She reminded America that dignity can still disarm arrogance, that the calmest voice in the room can carry the sharpest power. The clip went viral. The headlines exploded. Everyone had their take. But beneath the noise, something deeper lingered. The sense that this wasn't about one exchange on live TV, it was about what happens when someone refuses to play the game. When they choose respect over rage, substance over spectacle. Because Jasmine didn't just floor Kellyanne Conway. She floored a culture that mistakes cruelty for strength. She reminded us all that composure is not weakness, it's command. And now it's your turn. If you believe truth should always have the last word, share this. Talk about it. Keep this energy alive, because silence only serves the spin. History only changes when we refuse to look away. In the end, this wasn't just a debate. It was a mirror, showing us who we reward, who we listen to, and who we become when we let decency speak. The lights dim, the screen fades, but the echo remains. Steady, grounded, unshakable. This wasn't just a debate. It was a reminder that the mic belongs to whoever speaks with purpose,